Why do we fight? A question one has to ask. Why did so many people willfully join up, and what were the reasons for people to join these armies and fight this kind of war? Today, we look at our modern war, our current war, and ask about things like what we call the political will of our country, and its willingness to continue to wage war, the motivations of the individual soldier. And these are all important questions in dealing with the American Civil War. In the South, one has to ask, why did Southern soldiers fight? After all, most Southerners did not own slaves. So the preservation of the slave economy might, most people would say, well, why is this such an important matter to them? Clearly, if one believes that this is a war about slavery, why did a bunch of people who didn't own slaves choose to fight this war? Well, I can give a number of reasons. First of all, many did see the war as an invasion of the South. The North would have to apply an invasion-style tactic. They would have to apply an offensive tactic to win the war, whereas the South could fight more of a defensive campaign, and in order to do this, it had to attack Southern cities and towns. In so doing, it essentially galvanized some Southern support that might not have been there otherwise, because Northern soldiers were attacking and operating in the South, no matter what the reason. Most famously, once a captured soldier at Gettysburg was once asked by a Northerner why he was fighting this war, and he responded he was fighting for his rights. Another captured soldier, was asked why he was fighting, and he said he was fighting the war because you are down here, sir. In other words, this Northern soldier was in the South fighting. He owned no slaves. It didn't matter. They were what he considered enemy soldiers in his home, and he wasn't going to stand for it. Additionally, there was a concept of Southern honor, in that the South had a pride and a set of rights that they believed had been upset. And for this very reason alone, many men enlisted their services in the military for this very purpose. There's also the concept of identity. Many Southerners joined and sided with the Confederacy because it was what they identified with, meaning that they were fighting not for slavery or larger concepts of states' rights. They were simply fighting because their state was involved in a war. They identified themselves locally as people with a local identity, and felt more loyal, for example, to the state of Virginia than, say, to the United States as a whole. If given the choice between fighting for one or for the other, they would always choose Virginia. There are also a variety of social pressures to be loyal to your home state. For example, one common tactic was to have women encourage their boyfriends and their husbands and their brothers to sign up and enter service. And in fact, not entering the Army was seen as the mark of a coward, a civic slacker, a shirker, and those people were openly ridiculed. There were the equivalent of the modern Dear Abby advice column. It was written at that time in Southern newspapers for women, and many women would be asking questions. For example, what do I do if my boyfriend or my fiancé or my husband does not want to sign up? To the wife, it would be her duty to try to do everything in her power to convince her husband to join the glorious cause, as they would call it. For an unmarried woman, she would be informed to tell this coward that he was no longer her boyfriend or her beau. Engagements were broken over this matter, and that would be another suggestion. If you were engaged, well, obviously this isn't a worthy husband. Break off the engagement. So one way of pressuring men or encouraging them to join was that it was socially reinforced through a network of women. Another social pressure to be loyal to the state was, of course, your standing in the community. If you were a prominent member of a community, you would you were required almost. It was almost expected that of course you would join. Of course you would join the local militia or the local volunteers to fight. Finally, many people rushed to arms because they believed that the war would be short. It would end after one great big battle, and Southerners believed that they would win after they win the battle, that they would have their own independent country recognized, and that if they didn't sign up in a hurry, they would miss their opportunity to participate in this war and forever be branded as cowards and shirkers. In the North, one asks, why did these men fight? Of course, one was to preserve the Union. In fact, many people might say slavery was the reason many men in the North fought the war. This becomes problematic because, well, I will definitely argue slavery caused the war. Many people in the North would not have fought the war if it was a war about slavery, at least not early on. Lincoln was very adamant, constantly adamant in his messages about the war. As he tried to tell the South after his election, look, I'm not threatening slavery where it already exists. I don't believe I have any constitutional authority to end the institution where it already exists. I just don't want it to spread to the new territories. And in fact, he famously had said, if I could end this war by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could end this war by keeping every one of them in bondage, I would do that too. Lincoln feared that if he tried to make this a war of emancipation, he would lose support not only politically in Congress, but he just would not get enough people to sign up and bear arms. His duty, his first duty, he said, was to preserve the Union. The Southern states had seceded, and it was his duty to get them back. He intended to be president of all of the United States, as he would say. Only later does slavery become a motivating factor for fighting the war. Again, there were popular pressures up north to join. Once again, if you were a prominent member of your community, it was sort of expected that you would join the local volunteers. There were issues of patriotism, of course, too. Of course, if you were a patriotic American, you would join. However, you could, later on during a conscription act, a draft, after the war started to drag on, it was possible for one to buy a substitute. But early on, this wasn't necessary. Also, it provided steady employment. One of the aspects of, or reasons why some people fought in the colonial army we see in the American Revolution, we also see in the Union Army in the Civil War, which is it actually provided a source of employment to some people, and because of that, they signed and joined the Army. Again, just as in the South, in the North, many people in the North believed that the Civil War would be over after one great battle, that it would be a short war, and that if they didn't rush to arms, if they didn't participate in this rage militaire, to dredge up a term from our earlier unit on the Revolution, but if they didn't participate in this rage militaire, they would miss the war and, of course, forever be cowardly. Also, similarly, as the war went on, and got deeper and deeper into as it went longer and longer and longer, as it started to cut deeper and deeper into individual families in the country, as more and more men were killed in these long, horrible, bloody battles. One of the reasons many men stayed, especially, say, in Southern arms, towards the end of the war, as the end was near. You had many deserters, but the ones who stayed, just as in the North, many stayed because they fought not for any series of principles, but they fought for their comrades in arms. Basically, they had formed a bond with the people with whom they had served, and they would serve to the last with those men. Of course, famously, if you've read The Killer Angel or you've seen the movie Gettysburg, one of the famous examples of localism and identity in the North rears itself as the as the unit, a second Maine Volunteers unit was a unit founded in Maine. A number of men had signed short enlistment papers, and when their enlistments were up, they all left. Of course, there were there was a small group of Second Maine soldiers who had signed longer enlistment papers, and so they said that they did not care to fight anymore, being they signed only to fight with their unit and no other unit, and actually protested, saying that they were only going to fight with the Second Maine and their unit. Most of their unit went home, and they didn't care how long they said their enlistment was going to be. They were going to cut it off then. Of course, those men were marched under gunpoint and transferred to the 20th Maine, in which most decided to later fight, a number of them fighting at Gettysburg. The point I'm making with this story, I don't mean to get ahead, but the point I'm trying to make with the story is that just as in the South, local identity is also important in the North. It's just manifested a little differently. But in the end, why do we fight? There were different causes for both North and South in some cases. Well, the Northerners fought to preserve the Union. The Southerners would not have said they were fighting for slavery, trying to fight for the slaves themselves. The Southerners were fighting for what they saw as their rights, many would say. Now, one has to ask, why in this case? Both sides will deny that they are fighting a war over slavery. Yet, I argued that the main cause of the war was indeed slavery. Ask yourself, why do you think, why do you think both sides would say, this isn't a war over slavery, especially in the first few years? Why would they say that? Yet, one can argue that this is indeed a war over slavery. I believe it's a great demonstration of the kind of racism inherent both North and South, that was rampant both North and South, that these were people who did not believe in the humanity of African Americans, or at least if they believed that they were humans, they did not believe they were equal humans in any capacity, in the majority. And if they had said that this was a war about slavery, none of these people would fight because of these racist attitudes. So you can see how the language of the war and the language behind the causes of the war that's gone through time, actually disguises the actual cause. And it took some time for these soldiers to realize what the purpose of this war was, why we fight. And I think it's important for you to recognize this because it happens in a lot of wars. For example, if I asked you today, why did Americans fight World War II, many would say to liberate Jews from the concentration camps. But at the time, no one really entered the war thinking about liberating Jews from concentration camps. And in fact, many Americans had just as much anti-Semitic sentiment as some people in Germany. So, I mean, the question is, how do you take a nation with a rampant streak of anti-Semitic culture and convince it that it's fighting a war for this? I mean, this comes afterwards. Many times you'll see in wars, during the middle of the war, as the war wears on, people find its true purpose and they discover the true purpose of what they're doing. This will be the same for the American Civil War.